Now, it should be okay. Okay, hi everyone. My name is SUTELA. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Turku, and my major is in social policy. So my point of view to urban issues and urban studies is more stemming from welfare of residents and institutions. And in my work, I'm currently interested in policies against urban segregation, like how can we start to untangle or tackle this sort of big phenomena and multidimensional phenomena as urban segregation. This is like a background work for my PhD, and it will hopefully be a review article or a book chapter in the future, but I'm quite early on in my PhD, so all kinds of comments are like really welcome. And the reason why I'm studying this, I think it's quite obvious to all of us, like urban segregation is a really current matter, and it's really topical in European cities. And although in European contexts, like social segregation is not on such a big level as in maybe in other parts of the world, but we have still a lot of cities where segregation is really problematic. And I can tell you about little bits of Finnish context, because I'm from Finland, and it might be really confusing, like you don't even have a segregation in Finland, like why we are studying this. But it's more like we are really concerned about the current trend, like where in the future, where our cities are going, and this urbanization is in Finland really rapid as well, and we are really worried whether the trend in some point should go towards more segregation. Okay, yeah, that's it. Scope of this presentation, I will shortly go through the main factors or logic, how we currently understand urban segregation. And then I will go to this sort of major approaches, how European cities have tried to tackle urban segregation. These are not like specific tools, it's like more broad categories. And then I will go through shortly some risks and limitations that are apparent with each approach. And I will finish this presentation with some bonus, maybe if I have some time. It would be some tensions and blind spots we can see in the research right now, and some concluding thoughts and remarks, like why segregation still persists, like why we have, although we have done lots about it. Okay, so urban segregation is like super multidimensional phenomena. It's really hard to start to untangle like how to tackle this in the end. In the end, it affects the whole city. It's we cannot just look into some bad neighborhoods. We have to look at the whole city, like how status and reputation of different neighborhoods affect each other, like how they affect the migration between neighborhoods, and the housing policies, housing markets, which factors are, for example, driving up the housing prices. And it's a quite relative phenomenon as well. We cannot say like which level of segregation is okay and which is not, and we still want to have some personality between neighborhoods. So we want that the neighborhoods are a bit different, but not too much. But anyway, the main point is that probably like socioeconomically rich and poor people live in separate places. And for example, Skifter Andersson is talking about this sort of self-perpetuating spiral, and it's like a downward spiral, like when a neighborhood is caught in this sort of spiral, it just goes worse and worse and worse, and it's really like hard to tackle this process in the end. And there are different, you can talk about internal and external factors that affect this spiral in the end. They might be like, for example, what's going on in social policy and housing markets, or in global economy, or just the reputation and the social problems in that neighborhood that affect this spiral. And also there's a lot of local context, and it's really contextual phenomenon. Like, for example, last day we were listening lots of good presentations about Lisbon and how tourism is affecting the city and the housing prices. And this is, for example, this is not an issue in Helsinki where we both live. It's a total different factors that drive up the housing prices. Okay. And these are the main approaches to counter segregation. You can categorize them in different ways, and I'm in the process of finding like these sort of major categories, but basically we can find that there's a lot of social mixing and this area-based urban renewal and, for example, dispersal policies. But you can also categorize these sort of in a people-based or place-based and connectivity-based policies that are tackling different issues in a neighborhood or in the city as a whole. Social mixing is probably quite known and it's quite obvious, but you are in a different efforts, you are trying to either mix a new housing area or just with infill development, you are trying to create sort of a socio-economic mix or different tenure mix, like putting different, for example, rental and owned houses in different areas. And area-based urban renewal projects, they are usually huge. They might be like nationally led. For example, in Sweden and Denmark, there have been like huge operations which are like multi-stakeholders. There's public-private partnerships, and they usually pick several segregated neighborhoods and try to make their situations better somehow. And dispersal policies are, well, they are quite problematic, but the main idea is that you literally aim to disperse certain amounts of people. For example, in Sweden, they have done that asylum seekers who have gotten the permit to stay in the country, like you cannot choose your place to live, and you are sort of forced to live in certain place where Swedish government has assigned you to stay for a while at least. And also, if you look at these in a people and places and connections, you can see that you have to affect the people in social policies, employment policies, education policies, and so, etc. Place-based policies could be these different ways of making areas mixed. And also connectivity-based policies could be something like you're trying to make certain areas less isolated from the city. Okay, there are several risks and limitations with each policy. The basic problem is like it's here said in Vanham and Tamaro's paper, that place-based policies do not necessarily reduce poverty and inequality, and people-based policies might not have the desired local effect. So it's kind of a huge puzzle when you're trying to tackle this thing. Like you affect something on the other hand, and then the other part of the city somehow gets not so good. For example, if you have an effort to make a socially mixed area, you might in the end have a situation where you don't tackle poverty, which is the main issue of these people you're trying to help, but instead you just scatter poverty around the urban area, and that's not a solution at all. Urban renewal might have a serious risk of gentrification and force the original people to locate somewhere else. And also dispersal policies, like I said before, they are seriously problematic when it comes to being able to choose where you want to live. And also there's lots of research on slum clearances and these sort of demolitions that you just simply destroy people's houses and build something new, and this might risk destroying communities and social ties. And I'm not saying like these risks are happening every time you do this sort of policy, but you have to be aware if you're trying to do this. Okay, so in the end it's better to multitask and try to do several things at the same time in the long-term prognosis. Okay, and we can see some blind spots and tensions, like there are several things we are not currently discussing too much when it comes to urban segregation. For example, social sustainability is a huge topic that's still quite complex, and nobody really has any like proper definitions for it. And what is like a good living environment, like good livable city, and segregation research seems to, at least to me, it seems to be like really focused on bad neighborhoods instead of like how to make a good city, a good living environment. And there's also a question of middle classes housing choices, like where do those who can afford to choose where they live, like where they choose to live, and how this affects the city and the urban fabric. And there's also lots of questions about class, power, racism, who is defined segregated area, which is like a mixed area, and so on. And there's surprisingly little literature also about this sort of local contexts, like how much are they different somehow. Okay. Okay, and in the end, some concluding thoughts. At least to me, it seems like when it comes to tackling urban segregation in European literature, it seems like the basics are really lost. There's a lack of systematic and cumulative knowledge. It seems like there's lots of projects that are quite short term, but the knowledge just gets lost after the project is gone. And it seems like there are no long-term policies that are aiming in a long term to do this. Except maybe in Copenhagen, I've heard like they are trying to make this sort of a livable city agenda somehow. And it's also like there's a lot of lack of evaluations. Like you do some sort of big renewal project and you do some sort of evaluation. For example, EU has funded tons and tons of huge projects, but the evaluations are there, but they are not quite good. And the information is quite lost. There are problems with data, of course, and also these are sort of issues which are really difficult to evaluate. It's a really slow process to see some neighborhood, for example, getting better. But I must still say, like, a lot of literature is like concluding like these efforts are still not in vain. Like we should not just stop all these efforts to counter segregation, but we should be like aware like it might not have the huge effect we are expecting it to have. What I've also been quite surprised is like at least when I'm talking in Finland with local officials or local officials, more or less, there are some like really persistent beliefs and assumptions. For example, when it comes to social mixing or simply just racist attitudes towards ethnic segregation, and these are quite surprising to me. Like, and I think like systematic knowledge would be somehow helpful. There's one example in Finland. In quite many cities, there is this sort of goal of making 20% tenure mix. Like there's a 20% social housing in a certain area, and that's an aim that you want to have with a social mix. And we've been trying to like find out where this ratio has come from, and there doesn't seem to be any like research where this ratio is based on. It's just like somebody decided like, okay, ratio of 20% of social housing is good, and we stick to that. And I've also been thinking like maybe there's also quite aim for quick results. It's a politically really pressured thing to see some neighborhoods getting better. So you want to do some physical renovations and you don't mind so much about gentrification if you get some neighborhood to look better and you can show like, yes, there's some quick results, look at it, it's better now. And in the end, urban areas are quite slothful to move or change, and you should give the time for change. And also like social sustainability or affecting inequality might not be the top priority of cities. They might be like more interested in competing with other cities. They might be more interested in getting different private companies to the cities and getting more money, or tourism, etc., instead of like making the good city an equal city. Yeah, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution in the end. But there's quite a good article with Smets and Salmond, and I wish to finish this presentation with a quote. And it says, like, after all, countering urban segregation is not about leveling the city, but undoing unequal opportunities. And this is the point, I think, like affecting inequality and access and unequal opportunities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to move to the second presentation by Jutta Juvenius from the University of Helsinki. She's going to be talking about double standards of belongings as a means of coping with residential stigma, evidence from Helsinki.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Jutta Juvenius, and I'm PhD candidate from University of Helsinki. And today I'm presenting a collaborative article done by me and my colleague Linda Haapajärvi, who is unfortunately not here today, as on this very same moment she's having the public defense of her PhD in Paris, where she does her work and studies. So, this is already still in really like early phase, so we are really like glad to hear all your comments and ideas. I'm today just presenting some empirical findings, and we are developing this further next autumn, so we are glad to hear your comments. And to give some kind of like focus background to our article, I'm here explaining the background of the paper. So this thing is really topical to be studied right now in Helsinki, as there is this new growing internationality, because in the turn of 20th century, Helsinki actually was extremely diverse city with many ethnicities. We had, for example, Tatarians who came with Russian army and many other nationalities. But when during the 20th century, this was erased, and only now we are achieving the same level of internationality that we used to have way back. But on the same time, we have this internationality that is based both by work-related immigration, but also to asylum seekers. And there is this like bold discussion on like desirable and non-desirable immigrants. And also on public debate, the government is telling people to reproduce more, getting more babies, but also at the same time there is this rise of the racist movements and like general atmosphere also, like immigrants are not welcome to Finland. And in media, and there is also this strong myth of homogeneous nation. Even it's actually proven that people from Western and Eastern Finland are way more far from each other than, for example, Englishmen and Swedes. But in media, there is also strong public debate where well-educated, wealthy people are framed as tolerants and who are willing to like work towards ethnic diversity, and then less educated working-class people are framed as racists. And also we think it's important to study this, like how ethnicity and class are entwined in the context of housing, because housing is also one of the basic human needs. So our data comes from 2 different research sites. I've been in charge of collecting data from Area 1, and Linda has been in charge of collecting data from Area 2. And those both areas are built in the early 90s, so they are around 30 years old, and they have a mix of different tenure types. So there is both private owner-occupied housing and public rental housing. But there's some major differences between these 2 areas. Oh, well, they are quite far from each other. There is like 14 kilometers, I'd say. But also in social geographic sense of Helsinki, they are quite different. Area 1 is directly linked to Helsinki city center, and it's known as area for people working in knowledge-intensive industries. There is also plenty of office buildings, huge like companies like Nokia and like many other ICT companies. And on the other hand, Area 2 is far from eastern Helsinki. It's really far away from city center, and it's especially well known as area with high degree of non-European immigrants. And we both have conducted interviews on these areas. And now today I'm presenting now more subtle analysis on Area 1 because that's my specialty, and then later in the autumn we are going to join our data together and start to analyze these together. But already our first impression is that there is this great paradox between these observations and this current public debate that I was talking about, that these like well-educated people are framed as tolerant and who are like willing to work for diversity, and there are only these like less educated working classes are these racist, bad racist ones. And actually it seems that well-educated wealthy people, they are not that tolerant and multiculturalist as they wish to be presented. So first notes from the data. I went there, I conducted my interviews among housing company where there is actually both private owner-occupied housing and municipal public rental housing, which is also really rare in Helsinki. And I was mostly interested how these like tenure relations among this housing company work. And I had no single question about ethnicity in my questions, because this Area 1 is not portrayed as like multi-ethnic area. And I thought, I had no idea that it would be so significant. And when we found out, and then when I got my data, then we decided to write this paper. So actually this data was collected to totally different paper than we are doing right now. And there was like a high degree of suspiciousness based on these like different looking neighbors. They make like strong distinctions, and they were really suspicious, and they gave these like comments. Even the kids were seen as representatives for the whole continent, not even the country of origin, but whole continent. And here are some quotes from my data. And it was like there was this whiteness and Finnishness was seen as normal and standard. So from this on, when I'm speaking about different looking people, that's exactly how my interviewers are been telling to me, and I'm using like their words. And also they were doing these distinctions based by the looks, because I know that there are also some quota of like European immigrants, but they are like passing as whites, so my interviewers didn't pay any attention to them. And there was this like strong sense of these double standards. So to be accepted as parts of community, these like, again, different looking people, they were expected to act exceptionally well, and they were like, there was this like also strong double standards. How do you look? Because there are these like African looking and Asian looking, and as I said, that this data is collected from area that is well known as area for people working in ICT industries. So Asian lookings were expected to live in quite expensive expensive private rental apartments and working as engineers and everything like that on Nokia and other ICT companies, while the African-looking were claimed to be unemployed, living on social benefits. Even I know that that's not the situation because I've been meeting and talking to these people. And there was only few exceptions, which are like, for example, there's a family from some Western African country whose father worked at the embassy of the country of their origin as chauffeur, and then they all knew that he's actually employed because he was working as chauffeur, and that he comes for lunch breaks to visit home. And in Finland, embassy cars had these special register plates, so they were able to say that, oh well, he was having his uniform, driving his embassy car, so they was told that, oh well, those Africans, they are so shitty and everything. But then there is this one family, and we know that their father is working, and oh well, their kids behave so well. They never pass us on the corridor, and they always let elderly people to go to lift before everyone else. And they are so well trained, these kids. But there had to be something material that proves that they are employed, and suddenly that whole family was seeing on totally different shed of light. But on the other hand, there is some other families with African roots, and for example, their moms are working in daycare centers as child caretakers, but because they had no ability to prove, because there was no visible proofs when they come from their work back home, there's no proofs, so they were treated as unemployed and people living on social benefits. And I'm already now having some conclusions for this presentation. So, I only now focused to present my own data, but based on what I've heard about Linda's data, and we are going to do more deeper penetrating analysis for both of these. But on both areas, major population makes bold moral distinctions between us and the others. And there is definitely need for more subtle analysis on the practices and how these distinctions are made and what is the significance of these distinctions. Our primary thought might be that there might be different kind of practices between these different groups of people. So maybe our first assumption based on previous literature on Finnish neighborhoods is that as blue-collar workers, life is way more closely knitted to direct home and direct environment, is maybe why they feel that these others are violating the conventional way of life. But also at the same time, these more well-off people, they are they maybe might need a battle against social stigma. They are afraid that maybe that we don't want to be portrayed to living in multicultural area because that might cost the value of our apartments or something like that, but we don't know. And there is we need to collect a bit more data and do more penetrating analysis. But I don't know, we need to also think about some kind of theoretical viewpoints for our paper. But I'm happy to hear if you have anything to say.
Thank you very much. So should I open the floor for questions?
Thank you for these presentations. They were very interesting. And I have a question for Jutta. I don't know if you find in your field work a difference between the discourse of these people, your informants, your interviewers, between their discourse and their attitudes. For example, this kind of people of middle class that represent themselves as progressive, that they like to live in multicultural neighborhoods, but on the other hand, they can do this kind of sentences.
Yes.
And yeah, this because.
There is some difference between the way they speak and how they actually act, especially in this more like wealthy area, because when I was asking about what they have done, I heard that when the first summer, the only like incident, when there were only few incidents that were actually happening. Most of them were just like unpleased on their like environment due this like ethnic diversity. So they spoke that they are unpleasant, but they actually had, there was only little actions to like battle against this. But they're actually in the late 90s, when the first Somali refugees or asylum seekers came to Finland, I actually heard that the person who was then a chair of the housing company, or in Finland every housing company has a board that takes care of the like how to use common money and everything. The then person who was then a chair came to like kids playground with a knife, yelling to kids that go back where you have come from. But after that, that was like rare. That was really unpleasant, but rare exception. So most of them were just talking and not like acting. But still, even they had like quite successful encounters with their neighbors. When I was someone told me how there had been like much loud noise every night from Somali family, and she had come to their place and told them that, oh well, now it's night, I would like to sleep. And then I asked what has happened. Then she was like, oh well, I've been sleeping like maybe last 3 months because they don't keep noise that anymore, but I'm still hating them.
Thank you. There's one question over there.
So I have also a question for Jutta. For a while I lived in this very small town in Finland that was called Hämeenkyrö. And a few years ago they established this residence for underage refugees who came from Middle Eastern
Did you say
countries.
Underage?
Yes, underage. And there was this general discussion that they are not welcome to this town, even though they were kids. But after they lived there for a while, and I think they are still living there, that opinion changed a lot, and everyone was like spending time with them and liking them, and the general opinion it changed. And what I thought was interesting was that they started to talk of them as our refugees, our immigrants, and they kind of established this ownership for them. And at the same time, they didn't like any other immigrants or refugees. So I was thinking, did you see something similar in Helsinki, that they were talking about our immigrants, or this kind of funny ownership?
No, I didn't find any like patterns like ownership like these. These are like these we like and those we don't. But I think in my findings the most neutral most neutral relationship to these like other like immigrants were on those interviewers. I interviewed an elderly couple in their like 60s, and they had moved into housing company in early 90s with like kids who were at that time on that age that they used to play on playground. So they got to know these like Somali kids, and through them these parents got to know their mom, and because they had grown their kids together and everything, and I think they had the most neutral way of speaking of this like this family, and all the others were talking them as others. but they had this neutral. They mentioned that, oh well, when I was asking like what kind of encounters you have had with your neighbors within past month, and they were like most neutral. They were like, oh well, yeah, we've been doing this and that and that. And then they mentioned that, oh well, there is in downstairs there is this Somali family, and we sold our like old dining table chairs to them. And I was like, oh well. Then I asked that, oh, do you know them like more? And they were like, oh yeah, our kids used to play together like during past 15 years. And now all the kids are grown up, but we still like communicate with the mom.
Thank you for your engaging presentation, Jutta. My question is about more on the methodological aspect, but it's actually not asking about the method that you use, but more asking about the discussion about, to all of us, what if? So what if, since the data that you mainly base is on the interview process, so what if the interviewer or part of your research team, it's also a researchers who actually coming from non-European descendants immigrants? Would be the interviewees also as expressive as to you or not? Because in many other studies in Scandinavian countries or Nordic in general, sometimes the play out of the politics of appearance, it also will affect our research and understanding the whole area. This is probably not related to your specific case, but I just want to ask more on the more discussion. What if part of the researcher is also part of the groups that they are commenting about? Will they as expressive as to you, or what do you think about that, especially in the Finnish case?
Yes, this is a really interesting point, and that's something worth of thinking. And I don't know, because I pass as like white Finnish female, and I don't know how the situation would be different if there's some like my non-native Finn colleague, if you're asking this. I think situation might be like a bit different. I think, yeah. And that's like worth of thinking.
Okay, thank you. Are you going to ask the same speaker? Okay.
Thank you both for your presentations. I'm from Australia, and when I hear you guys speak, I'm hearing Australia 20 years ago. We now have 1 in 4 Australians that are non-European. But in reflection on your discussion about segregation, if you come to an Australian major city, people do cluster in their original country groups throughout the city, and we actually have a really strong identification with those streets. It doesn't play out in the sense of class, it plays out only in kind of cultural hubs. And as those groups age, segregation in that kind of sense has become actually really important, because they often lose their English. So we have nursing homes that might be German in the German sector. We might have Italian nursing homes, or at least Italian speaking in hospitals. So I'm intrigued by the fact that you saw it. I understand why it's negative in the sense of class, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of those positives that come, because I think that we really do identify our cities in Australia by having these kind of quite dominant cultural precincts. Okay. yeah, it's a good point. I totally agree with you. Like, there's like clustering with your cultural identity. There's major positive sides. Like, it might be also like a wish to cluster like this, and also it benefits, like at least in Finland we have still the levels of immigrations are really super low compared to other countries, but even we have seen that in some areas, for example in eastern Helsinki, there's like a certain clusterization of non-native Finns, and I can totally understand that, because it's well, the housing prices are fairly okay, but also like there's more open-minded things going on, and there's like more variety of different cultures. So I think it's a good thing as well. I'm more interested, at least in Helsinki and Turku, the city where I'm originally from in Finland, we are interested, do these clusters happen because people want to move there, or are they somehow forced to move there because there's not other options because of discrimination in the housing market, or you can't afford to live anywhere else. So I think there's some tensions going on here, which is chosen and which is locating where you can go. But I totally agree, there's massive amounts of positive sides as well.
Thank you. We have some few minutes left, I think, right? So I'll raise a couple of issues, maybe to both of you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One, I think that it was very interesting from your presentation that you said that there's actually you couldn't find systematic and cumulative knowledge.
Yeah.
So, which is very interesting because after studying so many policies, you see that there's no lesson learned. We have not learned anything, or in Europe, different countries have not learned much. I was wondering if when you were doing this systematic review, were you targeting different issues that relate to the policies? Were you thinking of, for example, you mentioned, were you thinking of economic development or touristification, which is, in fashion right now? Or what was behind that systematic search that you were doing? And this is for both. So when you talk about segregation, you're always thinking of migration or refugees, whatever, like the others, or you're also thinking of other kind of aspect that can relate it to segregation, and that how much relates to choice, that as something that you mentioned. Do you get to choose where you live, or does everyone have the same choice? And maybe if we're not thinking, shouldn't we be thinking about different type of segregations?
Okay. Yeah. So, my review process started as to start to look for what works and what doesn't work when it comes to urban segregation, and I quite soon realized this is a sort of a phenomenon where it's really difficult to find any causal relations, and the proper evaluations are just not there. But I was looking for these sort of specific public, national or local policies that are aiming to tackle segregation, but I understood segregation in a very broad way, but more in the sense is it about undoing poverty in spatial contexts, or undoing inequality in spatial contexts, or questions of social sustainability. But my aim in the end is to do this sort of a mapping review. I want to make an effort to map these different types of approaches. Touristification, for example, could be one issue, but I'm trying to look for articles that are specifically doing some sort of policy, or they are reviewing some sort of policy. If you want to answer the other question.
Sorry.
Different types of segregations. Can you repeat the second question again?
When you're looking for these policies that you're trying to map.
Yeah.
I was wondering maybe if we shouldn't be looking into different type of segregation, or even if the policies have the same aims, because you talk about reducing poverty, but I'm not so sure, especially if you focus in Europe. Europe always has goals, and these goals are changing. So, at this point, and I guess in the last maybe 10 years, is reducing poverty through touristification or entrepreneur. Everyone has to be an entrepreneur. And then, is that possible to happen in every part of the city, for example? So, because I think that it's not possible to have the same policy everywhere. So if you see, like you mentioned that you've seen a lot of touristification in Lisbon, which is very much true, but you only see that in certain part of the city.
Yeah.
Like maybe in the periphery, you don't see that. So it just, I think there's a level of complexity.
Yeah, it's definitely a level of complexity. Yeah. I think like the point of like different types of segregation, this is like really good. Like you can get segregated by class or ethnicity, and you can get like socioeconomic segregation, and these might be like different things, and you should like think of them as separate phenomena probably. I think like you can't put a certain policy maybe to every single neighborhood of the city, but at least, well, from Nordic context, it's really like a natural thing to think about. Like you have the governmental level, which is probably like thinking about lots of different things and doing this sort of basic general efforts to towards equality, hopefully. Well, not everybody agrees with our current government, but there's like these general efforts, but then you can have like these different levels, and you can have like these different policies probably around the city areas, because the areas are different as well.
I think we're running out of time, right? The next coordinator has arrived, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.